Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon and welcome to the Post 90, Yusef Waghid, Care, Compassion and Citizenship. We're here. As you know, in the last couple of vlog series, I've taken the zero number, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, and focused it on a singular human. A human being who has something to say to us and to our time. And many of these zero vlogs take some months to organise. In this case, it's taken about 20 years. And Yusef Waghid offers to us a lens for us to ponder, deliberate, and perhaps pivot. And the reason why I particularly wanted this professor, this gentleman, this great scholar to be our Post 90 is because there's a lot of very strange things happening on the planet at the moment. And many of those strange things, bizarrely, which is perhaps appropriate, are revolving around education. There's a lot of politicians, with or without the inverted commas, talking about education. And education is a specialist field. But the problem that exists when education is being discussed in policy and the politics of education is that everyone's a damn expert on education. You see, because everyone went to school, everybody supposedly has something to say about education. But at the moment, and that's always been the case, to be honest with you, everyone, I've got something to say about school, reading, writing, arithmetic, have you? That's great, fantastic. But at the moment, that fake expertise has turned toxic, and we're seeing all sorts of recent movements that are summoning particular words like, quote, woke, quote, libtards, end of quote, and of course focusing on the politicisation of education. You know, these damn left-wing academics are, altering how we think about truth and reality and what's important in life. And we're seeing that in nations around the world. Can I say we're also seeing it in Australia, that's about to go into an election as I'm recording the post this week. And Peter Dutton, who is a prospective Prime Minister in Australia, came out and said that the Australian people want their universities, quote, based on common sense and community values, end of quote. Now, let's be really precise here. Common sense is not education. Indeed, common sense is antithetical to education. It blocks thinking, critique, and debate. And what amazes me every day, stuns me every day, to be honest, is we've got this very complicated, very small group, but we've got this complicated group of right-wing populists that are often libertarians as well. So it's a very complicated slither of our political economy. And these right-wing libertarians are a very unfortunate group because they focus a great deal on freedom of speech. It's like, it's like one of those dolls you used to pull in the 70s. Freedom of speech, freedom of speech. And what's intriguing with their commitment to freedom of speech is they're also committed to stopping the freedom of speech of academics. So let's be clear on this. The best educated people in a society, they can't have freedom of speech, whereas the rest of the population can. And let's talk about the rest of that population. So for example, in the United States today, 50% of the US population has not read a book in the last 12 months. So we're happy to have freedom of speech of people who are not committed to learning, but silencing those that are committed to reading and writing and thinking. So the best educated people in the world have to be silenced, and then they're labelled and ridiculed with words like woke and libtard. Now this is unfortunate, it's an hypocrisy, but it's also incredibly short-sighted for the entire planet. So it is appropriate at this time that we focus on Professor Yusef Waghid, He's Professor, now Emeritus Professor, from the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. Remarkable man. He's published through his career 650 research outputs. His specialisms include the philosophy of education, particularly African philosophy, and global citizenship education, which is where I first came across his remarkable work. And look, I discovered his research. I went back to my very early notes, and I first read his work 22 years ago. And he wrote one of my top 50 books of all time. In fact, if I'm honest, it's probably in my top 20 books of all time. It's a book that I cite in about every third or fourth article or book chapter I write. And in fact, I cited it yesterday in an article on regional education. And this book is Towards a Philosophy of Caring in Higher Education, Pedagogy and Nuances of Care. What a title. And that book was published in 2019. This book, wow, it develops an infrastructure of care. It takes the trope of care and explores how it alters the trajectory and the project of higher education. And can I say, this is a weird sort of personal bit, can I say I've also used his expertise as a PhD examiner. So I think I've now finished 209 graduate students as a supervisor. So I've had to contact between 400 and 500, depending if a student has 2 examiners or 3, 500 examiners through my career. And one of those people was this remarkable professor. Now, I've never met him, but can I tell you, as someone who asked him to examine one of my students, he was, I think, the best examiner I've ever seen. He was precise, he was caring, he was incredibly rigorous and deeply compassionate to the student. He really knew what he was doing, and he knew the standards of work required in a doctorate. Absolutely amazing. And he was delightful to the student as well. Now, I've never met him, so I've had no other engagement with him at all, except I asked him to be an examiner. But he is one of those scholars, and I've got a few, where I read absolutely everything that they ever publish. So I'm just one of those completist people. He's written 650 publications through his career. I think I've read about 625. The other ones I'm still sort of seeking out, but they're in journals that were analogue and a little bit more complicated to find, but I will find them. But look, the point is, I might disagree with some of his arguments, perhaps. Perhaps I might disagree with some of the ways that he emphasises or interprets particular texts. But can I say that's the point of his career? He argues that discussion and debate, and a key word for him, deliberation, is crucial to what we do in higher education. Higher education doesn't exist without deliberation and debate. And the meta point I wanted to make in post 90 is also a significant one. And that is that higher education is an international enterprise. We have universities all over the world. And if we're only validating and referencing a few scholars from a few nations in the world, then we're not being completist. We're not being rigorous, and we're not being transparent. And what we're actually doing is we're replicating colonial structures. And what that means is we're activating in our daily scholarly life implicit and frequently explicit Eurocentrism. Now, as far as I'm concerned, ignoring whole nations and continents on the planet is a form of research misconduct. Now, and you may disagree with me, and that's okay. Researchers that lack the information literacy, the will, or the expertise to look beyond a couple of languages, often only one language, to not be able to get beyond a particular bodily presentation, to connote currency and importance, and also to not read beyond very specific geographical locations. So put another way, I've often told you this story, and it did traumatise me, but it's a great story to tell. When I was an impossibly young master's student, yes, I was once a young woman, but when I was an impossibly young master's student in the 90s, right, everyone was wearing black turtlenecks, black skivvies, right, black. We're just wearing black. Great. And I went to a seminar at the University of Western Australia as a little master's student. And this incredibly powerful and deeply frightening woman at the end of the seminar asked this question. And the question was, you have cited no women in your presentation. There's no women cited in your presentation. Why? And the whole room went, bless her. Now, that's not my politics, can I say. There's nothing about possessing a vagina or not possessing a vagina that is the pathway to truth and reality and expertise and intelligence. If we connect a part of our body with intelligence, then that's identity politics. And if that's your politics, I wish you well, that's great. It's not mine. I respect your right to do that, but that's not my view. My view is that what matters through all of this is information literacy. So if, for example, there are no women in your reference list or bibliography, that means that 50% of the population have been excluded from your research, excluded from your search. Now, that exclusion may be implicit or indeed explicit. But that means for some reason you've decided that 50% of the population are not worthy to be cited. Now, my argument is you have not been thorough, right? You have not searched widely to ensure that you've got transparent, generalisable and verifiable data sets. Now think about the African nations. So the African Union contains 54 members, 55 now that Morocco is in the African Union after an absence of 33 years. But if the European Union was simply excluded from references, so you were writing something and just no French theory was there, no Greek philosophy was present, then everyone would go, well, that's a research error. You're not demonstrating rigour and wide-ranging research skills. But how often are you checking your bibliography to see that the remarkable scholars from Algeria are present, or if you're working on regional development and city imaging, as I am at the moment, that you're citing the incredible scholars from Nigeria looking at urbanity and urban theory? Now, what I'm talking about here is not identity politics. It's making sure that your research is expansive and you're capturing the best scholars wherever they may exist anywhere in the world. And I became particularly aware of this and my own ignorance and how I need to sort myself out when I delivered a keynote for a conference on comparative literature and globalisation at the University of Clef. Wow. It was an incredible experience. I was delivering a keynote at 3 o'clock in the morning, and it was an incredible experience, incredible scholars, and I had to confront my own ignorance, which is always a powerful, extraordinarily significant moment of our lives. And I had to confront my ignorance that I didn't know that the Algerian Scientific Journal platform exists, right? Wow. So what this is, I mean, it's just amazing. It's a platform that gathers together all the journals produced in Algeria, multiple languages, all disciplines. And the reason it exists is to ensure that quality assurance is in place for every journal coming out of Algeria, that there's proper refereeing, proper tracking of blind refereeing. An amazing project, this. Unbelievable. And so what that platform is allowing is the development of journals and journal quality in Algeria, tracking quality assurance. Wow. I now referee for 6 of these journals, and every single article, every single book that I write, I go into this platform and I do a search on the topic to see what journals and what new authors I can discover. It is an amazing experience. So I can go in there, use the search tool, which is a fantastic one on a particular topic, and see what is being produced in Algeria. And the calibre of the research that I have discovered is stunning to me, and it humbles me. The trouble is, I think, that we talk so much these days about the ranking of journals and publishers and indeed universities, but so much of that ranking ignores the rest of the world. We as educators are replicating the inequalities and the injustices of colonisation, implicitly or explicitly. Now, Professor Waghid provides the bridge, the scaffold, and the consciousness for all of us, every human on the planet, to transform our way of thinking, to transform our assumptions about research, space, place, and time. He carries forward, I would argue, the great tradition from the discipline of education, and that is the philosophy of education. Now, in the old days of a Bachelor of Education, and remember I am that old and I've done a Bachelor of Education, but in the old days of a Bachelor of Education, there would be 3 pillars that would hold up every course or topic that you would do. And they are the philosophy of education, the sociology of education, and the history of education. Now, that type of language is now leaking out of education degrees with attention to classroom management or educational technology. And look, I understand why that shift is in place, but there are costs and consequences of that movement. And because Professor Waghid is a specialist in the philosophy of education, he has the expertise to move our mind furniture, to confront us with our fundamental understandings of teaching and learning and education. And what he's doing is he's gifting to us the language, the theory, the tropes, to battle those who wish to base education on common sense, on consensus, rather than truth and reality and investigation. Now, Professor Waghid lived a chunk of his life under the apartheid regime, and he's written about it evocatively and powerfully. And he's used the apartheid regime to confront all of us in our thinking today. Because imagine in apartheid South Africa, if the focus was on ensuring that education fulfilled community values and consensus. In apartheid South Africa, well, we don't have to imagine that. We can actually see the consequences of that today. So we've got an apartheid regime, and the consensus within that is repressive for the overwhelming majority of the population. It's consensus and commonsensical. It also happens to be unjust and wrong. And that's why education, from early childhood education, respect to all the early childhood educators out there, right the way through to a PhD, has to be so much more than based in consensus, restating the truths from an earlier time that gain currency through the repetition. Learning exists not so that we fit in, but so that we transcend and transform. Professor Waghid, through his research, has helped all of us configure a revisioning of Eurocentric education. That's not a bad contribution from a scholarly life, is it? You see, what he's done is he's rebuilt our understandings of teaching and learning, teacher and students, in different ways to activate different traditions, different ways of thinking. And he has, through his 40-year career, offered some incredible innovations to all of us that work in education. And the first, can I say, this is where I met him, inverted commas, met him intellectually 22 years ago, was he offered, I would argue, the most important, the most radical reconfiguration of doctoral education on the planet in the history of the scholarship of supervision. And what he did was, he said that doctoral education was teaching and learning. And so therefore PhD supervisors required careful education in andragogy, in pedagogy. They required careful education in theories of teaching and learning. And he offers very different relationships between students and teachers, students and supervisors. Now, this is an absolutely crucial innovation. And this is someone speaking these words who's been a Dean of Graduate Studies, Dean of Graduate Research for a lot of the last 10 years or so. And can I say, lots going wrong in doctoral education, and there are many causes of the wrongness. But one of the challenges is that doctoral education exists around the world in research portfolios. Now, I understand why that occurs, right? So if you're doing a PhD, you're often administered from a research portfolio. But the challenge is that graduate education is both. It's teaching and it's research. It's the only area really that works at the interface. And that's why too often, because it's in a research portfolio, the needs of PhD students are being displaced. And they're being displaced for the greater good of a particular research project or funding or metrics. So students are simply workers, sometimes described as slaves to a PhD, to a research project. And that's why really poor supervision exists in our universities and is sustained in our universities. There's all these assumptions that exist in doctoral education about experience and homology. Supervisors use their data set of one, that is, they use their own experience of a PhD as a generalizable model for teaching and learning in the rest of their lives. Yeah, nah. Now, Wahid critiques radically this way of thinking. He's also very concerned about graduate students, arguing that they are deeply unprepared and underprepared as they enter a program. Again, crucial point, very courageous point. Hard to say that these days. He said it. So students are coming into a doctoral program really unprepared for the work they have to do. That is what we are seeing. And because the teaching part of doctoral supervision is very rarely discussed, students ignore the key crucial statements and advice being offered by supervisors, because students of course assume that they know what they're doing. They've got a data set of one and assume that they know what they're doing, and they're not listening to the people that are trying to help them. And what Professor Waghid does is configure new systems and strategies to enable a different way of thinking about doctoral studies. So supervisors and students stop applying a data set of one and actually use research about teaching and learning to improve the calibre of supervision. Now, one of my favourite books that he's written about the student-supervisor relationship, he describes the relationship as a dance, which is beautiful. Movement, meaning, building trust, building a relationship. But he's also logged the catastrophe really of what's happening in our moment, that is today, in higher education. And in March 2025, he published a really powerful, staunch article in the South African Journal of Higher Education. It's a great piece. And the title is important here: Higher Education in Crisis Again, encroached by authoritarianism, unfreedom and violence. What a title. And it's a great piece, can I say. It's about 7 pages, not long at all, but a great piece. And he argues that universities, historically, are institutions of, quote, critical inquiry, deliberation and democratic engagement, end of quote. but now they are being actively targeted by authoritarian regimes through the need to constrain academic freedom. So those in power are silencing scholars in higher education and truncating institutional autonomy, most frequently by simply restricting the funding that government provides to these institutions. So you need to control your academic freedom and indeed control your academics, and if you don't, we will withdraw funding. Okay, so to make this argument, he explores the history of academic freedom in Africa and the consequences of fighting colonial repression and then post-colonial authoritarianism. He argues that universities must hold on to these core values: freedom, deliberation, justice, and all three are crucial to academic life. His reasoning through this is important, and it comes through his deep and profound work in African philosophy and the tradition of Ubuntu. Changed my life, this. And he shows how education, the point of education, is to promote public good, full stop. But also through public good, we activate human dignity, interconnectedness, and justice. I particularly want to log his phrase about what universities do. You know, what's the point of a university? And he argues that universities provide, quote, love this, quote, spaces for inclusive deliberation, end of quote. That phrase, inclusive deliberation, you can base a whole career on that phrase. It's transformative in its power. And it also slots into his arguments that he's been developing for 20 years about the philosophy of care and caring in education. And again, towards philosophy of caring in higher education, that's the book that changed my life. It really is the companion through my life at this point. And he argues that university infrastructure must be specific. It will be very different from the infrastructure that exists in other industries and agencies throughout an economy, because it's got to be both part of local histories, but also be outward and international in its inflection. It must be both. So this is not about caring for or caring about. This is caring with others, caring as a sort of reciprocal process of care. This isn't about fixed roles or fixed responsibilities. We're back to that dance once more. This is the, quote, fluctuations of attachment and detachment. Fantastic. So, for example, let's apply this. How does care operate in doctoral education? Well, we care for ideas, we care for rigour, we care for arguments, and we also care about the human that's making those arguments. So when we offer care, that is an act of inclusion. Conversely, Wahid argues that exclusion is an act of violence. And we see, I think, the impact of Freire here, of course, pedagogy of the oppressed, pedagogy of freedom, stressing the importance of caring for students and authentic teaching and learning. Important word there, authentic teaching and learning. So students, through this authenticity, become bold. They become adventurous. They speak out against human misery, exploitation, suffering. So to enable these engagements, teachers must show humility, but also patience. Instead, I think too often, as he argues, quote, higher education can be a highly exclusionary activity where colleagues would not hesitate to make you feel somewhat unwelcome. End of quote. Again, what an amazing writer he is. somewhat unwelcome. Incredible. But what Wahid recommends is to create a culture, a context, an infrastructure of care. So supervisors and students have that dance of andragogical engagements. They're both present, they're informed, and both enter a learning dialogue to learn from each other. Now, supervisors, certainly we have a role to create a context. And in that context, we want students to grow and stretch and change. And if we get this infrastructure of care right, every wrong that happens from a student can be transformed into another opportunity to be right. Supervision creates the context to take risks. But Professor Waghid is also very clear. He's very clear on his diagnosis of the threats that exist in our time, best revealed in his great book, The Thinking University. Again, wow, what a title, The Thinking University, which I recommend to you. And the challenges he diagnoses are extremism, anti-democratic populisms, energy crises, and, quote, extreme forms of vindictiveness, end of quote. Summoning Derrida, academics must be more than, quote, technicians of learning, end of quote. But he questions the provocations that he offers us are real and they're meaningful. Can a university be democratic? Again, you can base a whole career around that one question. But he also asks, what are the public responsibilities in the creation of knowledge? And how can the past inequalities in higher education be addressed today? Most significantly, he reminds us about the importance of the philosophy of education. He welcomes a diversity of approaches, and I've learned a great deal from him in his explorations of Muslim education in particular. I knew very little, much to my shame. I know a lot more now because of this remarkable man. And so for me, some of his most profound work, and again, changes me deeply, I think about it deeply, is he explores the role of certainty in citizenship. You see, if one is certain of something, I am certain of this, what does that do for citizenship? Well, that certainty, firstly, stops deliberation, stops questioning. Learning is not anchored in certainty. It's anchored in doubt. So Wahid has been very critical of educational technology, quite rightly. It's being used as a panacea, so whatever problems exist in higher education, technology will provide the answer. Generative AI is the great example of that. I can't tell you how many conferences I've gone to in the last year, and I've asked a question that I really want the answer to, and someone's gone, oh, look, I think probably generative AI will be able to answer that question. Rubbish. Stop this, stop this. Educational technology is an answer to questions we are not asking. Sort yourself out. And most importantly, he values high theory, really complex theories, and how they are used in the discipline of education. This is so welcome because as someone who is a former professor of education, but also a former head of school of education, I remain deeply concerned about the scope and scale of reading that is taking place in education degrees to this day. But Wahid exemplifies a different way of working in education. He cites Derrida, he cites Lyotard, he's a dag, he cites Deleuze and Guattari, and he explores how these high theorists can be used to transform how we think about assessment in education. Instead of assessment focusing on the product, what is learned, Wahid is very interested in looking at what Popham described as, quote, assessment literacy, end of quote. So Professor Waghid has a lot to offer our time, in our time of challenge and fear and despair. Particularly, I ask that we remember his phrase, quote, deliberative encounters, end of quote. Education is liminal. It is an intellectual pilgrimage. And by pilgrimage, I mean all of us today go and visit the past of knowledge with respect, but see what is of use to our present. His focus remains building relationships on respect and, quote, love this, quote, teaching with hope, end of quote. Doctoral education for him becomes, quote, an ethical process of becoming, end of quote. Wahid gives us all permission to tell what he describes as academic stories, but his career, and particularly his recent work, is dominated by warnings for us all. And so I wanted to finish with his 2024 book, Philosophical, Educational and Moral Openings in Doctoral Pursuits and Supervision. And in this book, he summons a model, a trope of the 3 W's. Now, this is quite challenging for the Australian accent. So the 3 W's are wonder, so that's W-O-N-D-E-R, to wonder, wander, W-A-N-D-E-R, and whisper. Wander, wander, and whisper. And he states, quote, when academic pursuits like doctoral education are no longer advanced in the interests of critical reason, a university fails to uphold its esteemed intellectual and moral position in society. He also warns, quote, corrupt practices such as conferring doctoral degrees on some students undeserving of such an accolade, end of quote. Very courageous saying that. Most of you remember when I got into doctoral education, I particularly walked away from things I loved doing and wanted to work almost completely in doctoral education. I did that because I described it as the last stand for standards in our universities. We've lost so many commitments to standards through my life, and the PhD for me was the last point where we can fight for standards. And I think, sadly, we've now lost the doctorate. A tragedy. But what Wahid logs is a loss of theoretical rigour in theses, a lack of deep thinking in theses. Knowledge is constructed that's disconnected from its social context, and he also expresses deep concerns with research ethics and research misconduct. Yep. And he is also waging a war, it's not on his own because I'm with him, about what's happening to the book, to the scholarly monograph. And the Department of Higher Education and Training in South Africa is no longer providing any subsidies or funding for the book, because they've described the book as, this is a scholarly monograph, 80,000 words. They're describing the scholarly monograph as more creative rather than research. This is absolute rubbish, obviously, and clearly our educational structures are crumbling. But the question is, what are we going to do about that? Professor Waghid draws us back to foundational ideas: autonomy, restoration, democratic citizenship. And it's up to us now to cultivate what Wahid describes as, quote, public pedagogical spaces and, quote, love this, quote, taking responsibility for the rights of others. End of quote. He was the first black professor in Stellenbosch for 100 years, and he fought for, quote, the right to have rights. End of quote. It's so easy to lose democratic education. It can simply fall through our fingers. But you see, that is why doctoral education matters so much, because it builds the capacity not only of our universities but also of society, because it is developing future researchers. Doctoral education is pivotal to democracy. Let me say that again. Doctoral education is pivotal to democracy. So whenever you hear a random say, there are too many people doing a doctorate, too many PhD students are being enrolled and graduated, there's too many women enrolled in PhDs. What's a 50-year-old man doing enrolled in a PhD, or a 70-year-old man enrolled in a PhD? Now we need to take a breath and then recognise the function, the political function of that question. So, why would you be wanting to reduce the education of a human being? Why would you be wanting to reduce the higher education of a human being? Why would you wish to reduce the research education in our societies? Whenever you're asked why you're doing a PhD, or why you decided to enroll in a PhD 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 30 years ago, follow the example of Professor Waghid, and he holds 3 doctorates, by the way, PhD, Doctor of Philosophy, DPhil, and a Doctor of Education, 3 doctorates. He speaks of the value of doctoral education in democracy. So in a time of influences, how about we value scholars? In a time of opinion, let's validate knowledge. In a time of populism, how about we show the courage and be prepared to be unpopular? In a time of extremism, build relationships. So let's show courage to continue to read and continue to think. And let's continue to read and think locally, but also globally. Let's transcend ourselves and read of and for the world. I wish you love, light, and peace. Tia.